All right, so I'm going to be speaking about something that I've never seen someone speak about in the self-development space. And I'm sure there's someone that's spoken about this. I just haven't seen it. And I'm going to be sharing some really personal information with all of you, hoping that it reaches the right people. And I absolutely know that it will. So, since I was a child, I've had homicidal fantasies, homicidal thoughts, and homicidal desires that were heavily driven by trauma and heavily driven by anger. And when I say since I was a child, I don't mean I experience those things now, but for a lot of my life, my adolescence, my teenage years, and a lot of my adulthood, I absolutely, experienced those things to the point that I actually created a reality for myself to where I could actually exercise those desires and exercise those urges in the form of violence. Because in the streets, in the jail, and in the prison, it's okay to do that. In fact, this makes you popular. This makes you cool. This kind of puts you on the top of the food chain. So rather than being in an environment where I was shamed for doing that, I was now in an environment where it felt good to do that, not only because I was exercising that desire that I had, but other people looked at me like I was someone when I would hurt someone else. And I have hurt many, many people in my life, upholding this image that a lot of us uphold when we're living the street life, when we're in the jail, when we're in the prison, when we're living the gang life or whatever it is. All of this for me began when I was younger, and when I would get angry, it wouldn't just be like normal anger. I would think about killing people. And I would have these fantasies of like murdering the person and even murdering people that had nothing to do with the person, murdering their whole family and torturing them and some really, really sick shit. And these kinds of thoughts and desires were with me for a very long time until I went through a deeper healing process within myself and I began unblending from the parts of me that were having those desires. So what I realized in my process of self-development, it was never me, the person I am today, my true self. It was never that person that was having those desires. But I had these parts of me that were playing these very, very fragmented roles. And these desires and these strong urges and these fantasies were rooted in early childhood trauma that actually began with my mom giving me up for adoption. And when my mom did this, she was not trying to hurt me. She wasn't trying to put me through any abuse or anything like that. But on a soul level, and a nervous system level, I registered that as abandonment. And I carried this abandonment with me for a very long time to where I actually kind of recreated myself by creating this shell of an identity that made me a menace to society. I actually enjoyed being the reason that people would look over their shoulder, And in the streets, I was known as a real crazy person. I was known as a real violent dude. And even though the homicidal thoughts and the homicidal desires and just wanting to hurt other people, it was rooted in early childhood trauma. So the wounded inner child, there was also a part of me that would hold on to that anger, and this is known as a protector part. And this protector part of me was shielding me from experiencing the pain and the suffering of my wounded inner child. So when I would feel disrespected or I would get triggered, I would want to eliminate you. I'd want to whack you. I would want to whack your whole entire family and people that had nothing to do with maybe what took place between me and you. Because at least if I did that or I enacted some kind of violence against you, at least that was better than feeling that wounded inner child coming through my system. So we have the protector parts, and then we have these other parts that are deeply suppressed that the protectors are programmed to keep us away from. And oftentimes, these protectors can play very, very extreme roles. So mine, it had this identity and it had these homicidal desires, and it developed this role to where it was like, if you fucked with me, I was gonna hurt you, or I was going to hurt your family. I was gonna show up and I was gonna put a bunch of holes in you, and I was not the guy that you wanted to mess with. But deep down, there was this wounded inner child inside of me driving all of this, driving me to have these very dark fantasies. And I've had these fantasies for a majority of my life. Now, where things began really changing is when I started doing invocation practices with spirits. I started to not feel good about the things that I was doing. So, for example, when I started to do a lot of these practices, I was actually incarcerated and I was waiting to go to state prison. I was in county jail waiting to go to state prison. And although, for the most part, I pretty much um carried out acts of violence all the way to the door. So like I got into fights, I was stabbing people. They used to call me Soap Sock Swerve, because I was known for kind of having a soap in a sock and I would use it during like violent altercations and stuff like that. I kind of got into those behaviors all the way into the door. However, as a result of this momentum that these practices were initiating, I started to see this contrast forming between my true self, which didn't want to do these things anymore, and my false self that was still kind of wrapped up in the streets, and it had a lot of anger that it was holding on to. And when you would piss it off, it would want to harm you, it would want to hurt you. And in the jail environment, it would want to poke you up and it would want to make you an example to other people to not fuck with me, because deep down I was actually afraid. And this kind of goes back to that protector part. It's, even though it's playing a very extreme role, it's protecting us in the way that it knows how to. And that's how I kept myself safe in that environment. I exercised these urges that I've been having my whole entire life, so in the form of violence, and I created a reputation where I wasn't exactly the person that you wanted to try, because, I was going to sucker punch you, I was going to stab you, I was going to hurt you, I was going to go all the way. So these occult practices began to create this momentum inside of me to where I started to view things differently. I started to view other people that I used to like, in a sense, be really close with, and to some degree, I would say even admired, if that makes sense. I don't know if admire is the right word, but that's what I'm gonna use right now because I can't think of another word. I looked at these dudes like, okay, he's about his business. Awesome. He just poked that guy up in front of everyone. Yeah, he's a dog. But I started changing by doing these practices, and I viewed it different. I started to see people as, wow, he's just putting on a show for other people. That doesn't make you rugged. That doesn't make you a dog. And I started to see that a lot of people were just very, very wounded, and they were running away from what was going on inside. And I also came to the conclusion that's what I was doing. So I got out of state prison after doing 4 years straight, and this is when this momentum really started to manifest for me in the form of very tangible changes within myself, within my personality, within my goals, and within the life that I was living. And I stepped away from the gang life. I stopped gang banging. I had a couple of slip ups, but for the most part, I stopped hurting other people. And, I started to create these really heavy triggers. So, like physical circumstances and conflicts with people that were bringing up all of these suppressed emotions inside of me that I was actually holding on to before, which was causing me to have these homicidal fantasies. And I was dealing with these triggers in a different way than I would have dealt with them before. So instead of wanting to blow your brains out or to harm you or to fight you or whatever it was, I started self reflecting, what is it that is going on inside of me that I need to work on? And I started viewing everything in my reality as being an extension of me that I could utilize to better know myself and to further this momentum that I had began creating back when I was incarcerated, doing these, high magic ritual invocation practices that led me to the point that I'm explaining now. Triggers, although we typically are programmed to avoid them and to demonize them and to look at them as a bad thing, they are 100% a really good thing and a really valuable tool that we manifest for ourselves, typically on a subconscious, unconscious level, to help surface suppressed emotions that are in association with trauma that can go back to early childhood, intergenerational trauma. It can even get a little deeper than that, but we're gonna keep it basic for this video. Triggers are something that helped me evolve so much. And the occult practices that I was referring to earlier in the video were these practices where I was calling these extraterrestrial entities, these extraterrestrial beings, into my body. And although I didn't know what was going to take place in my system at the time, I felt intuitively led to do it and I honored it. But I didn't really know the connection between these occult practices and resurfacing trauma in order to heal it when I was doing these practices while I was incarcerated. When we're calling these spirits, these beings into our body, it's going to naturally cause this resurfacing effect to happen. And oftentimes, physical circumstances will align to where we create experiences with other people that can be very challenging because that person is a self-created catalyst and a self-created trigger meant to bring up all of these deeply suppressed emotions so we can finally release them. And remember, it's these suppressed emotions that I was holding on to and I didn't know how to process that led me to having so much anger in my system that I was harming other people and that I was having these homicidal fantasies, from the time I was fairly young and, moving into my adulthood. So these triggers gave me the opportunity to release that energy by feeling through the emotions, which is also giving us the opportunity to heal through the trauma, to heal through the very trauma that even caused me to create this protective program within my psyche to where I had this personality or identity construct that was very willing to go out and harm other people. I had this part of me that was having all of these homicidal fantasies. But once again, I started to realize that it was not me that was having those thoughts. And it was not me that was having those fantasies. It was a part of me that was forced into a very extreme role because of those suppressed energies that were in my system. So when I started processing these energies that were coming to the surface as a result of these occult practices, this gave me the ability to unblend from that part and to ultimately die with my identification with that part being me when that was never me to begin with. I just became very blended with it. And of course, I didn't have the education at the time to even understand that that part wasn't me. But, as I started doing these practices, this momentum started to take place within my system and within my life, to where not only these emotions were coming up to give me the opportunity to process them, but I also started to educate myself on trauma. I started to become very interested in trauma because I knew that this was going to be an important part of my process and an important part of understanding what was going on in my system. A major part of my process was these triggers that would manifest. And whenever we're talking about working with darker entities like I was, or working with the darker aspects of occultism, we're going to be working with the darker aspects of ourselves. So these triggers gave me the opportunity to start experiencing this anger, but in a different way, to where I was no longer going out into the world and trying to harm other people. Instead of bypassing that anger was actually a cover up for this abandonment, for this neglect, for this fear, and for this sadness. Instead of bypassing what was going on, I started to work with that anger and I started to experience it in a healthy way, to where I started releasing it from my system and even healing through the trauma that was underneath the surface of that anger. And as I did this enough, I, basically stopped having these homicidal urges. And I've even manifested conflicts to where I didn't want to hurt the other person, or I didn't want to hurt the people involved, because I was no longer operating from this part of me that wanted to hurt people, and basically, we can even say, got off on harming other people for so much of my life. And when we're talking about the darker aspects of the occult, we are also talking about working with death energy. So I died to my identification with that part, and I got to step back from it and actually view it as my true self, as my higher self, almost like, as being like my higher self looking down on my human self, or the human self, and seeing how these parts of me were running my system and getting the chance to really be unblended from that part and to observe it and to actually connect with it in a healthy way, to where I kind of repurposed it to where it wasn't playing a role to keep me safe, to where it was having all these crazy homicidal urges and homicidal desires. But none of this would have happened if the momentum caused by these occult practices didn't create some significant triggers to take place in my life, because then these deeply suppressed emotions wouldn't have came up in the way that they did. As a result of all this deeper work that I've done, I went from having all of these homicidal thoughts and even physically harming more people than I can count on both hands, and if I were to use my feet, I went from being that person to dying to that person, processing the trauma that was driving that person to be that person, and I've stepped into a completely new me, to where I have compassion for people that I never had before. And even if a person were to manifest in my reality to challenge me or to pose as some type of enemy, I wouldn't want to harm that person. What I'm going to do first and foremost is I'm going to self-reflect on, why am I creating a reality where someone is manifesting who is doing whatever it could be that I may perceive as some type of threat, or a person who is posing as some type of an enemy to me. And I'm going to go through that self-reflection, and I'm going to release whatever suppressed energies in my system are connecting me to that person, and I'm going to go on my way, and I'm going to continue to evolve, and I'm going to continue to grow. And I'm just not a person anymore that wants to harm other people, even if there's a person that's maybe standing against me, even if there's a person maybe saying things that aren't true or projecting anger towards me. I understand that I am a very powerful creator, and even when I'm not conscious of why I'm creating something, I know that I'm always creating whatever the experience is to serve me. So there's no reason for me to hate the other person or to want the harm the other person. And if they're projecting themselves onto me in a way that's inappropriate, they're just hurt. And I remember when I was hurt enough to actually go out and physically hurt other people. So I have completely reinvented myself, and I have completely changed. But I had to go through a lot of healing, and there's still things that I'm still healing through. I had to process a lot of anger. I had to process a lot of really heavy emotions. And I just had to choose to be a different version of myself. And I had to let go of certain friendships and unhealthy coping and things that were more so associated with the old me. But today, I stand as a completely different version of myself. And man, I have come a long way, because years ago, I could never even imagine being up here speaking about what I'm speaking about right now. So I think that's everything that I wanted to say. I appreciate every single one of you for being here and, listening to my story. Feel free to drop down in the comments. And if you have experience with what I'm talking about, let me know, and let me know where you're at in your process of healing.